Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the next in our series of Praxis Plus Rapid Insight Solutions Finding Sessions. And today we're going to be talking about good clinical practice and hopefully looking at some of the trickier questions that you might encounter in your practice, but also some of the more common ones as well. We've got a great panel of GCP experts who are going to help guide the discussion. So we'll just wait until everyone has joined. We've got about half of the expected audience here so far, so we'll give you all another little while. And we hope that you're all doing okay, whether you're in Sydney and in lockdown, and Kelsey's just been describing to us how stressful the situation is for them in the southwestern Sydney local health district and Liverpool Hospital and Ingham, and we send our support to all of them. But also for any of you in Melbourne who are waiting for news today of what future restrictions might look like for you. So we might continue on and people will join as we progress. So as always, we acknowledge Australia's First Nations peoples as the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands that we live and work on, and we recognise their continuing connections to land, waters and culture, and we pay respect to their elders past, present and future. And I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people here in Greater Adelaide. I know Sophie's in Hobart. Sophie, your speaking is that I can't remember the Hobart traditional owners. Who are they?
Having only been here 4 weeks, Melanie, that's something I need to work out. While we're talking, I'll work that one out.
Oh, good. Okay. And Alan, you're coming to us from Melbourne today?
I am, yes. And you raise a very, very important point to me that I need to go and do some critical research right now. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Very bad of me, Melanie.
Please, Kelsey, please tell me that you know the lands of the people that you're...
I think it's Dengari. But
okay.
Then, you know, I'm obviously in space, so I really don't know.
I've got some homework for you all, and that is to go and make sure that you know about the traditional owners and caretakers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely imperative. Okay, let's continue on. So I also wanted to take this opportunity just to remind you about our GCP trainer program, which we run in conjunction with Sophie Mepham and her other business, Sophie Mepham GCP. You can find out more information on our website. You can reach out and speak to us, but it's certainly been one of Australia's most comprehensively used GCP training systems across every state to train institutions. And I know Kelsey has been part of that program. In fact, was one of the very first trainees that came out of the Train the Trainer program. So let's keep going. A little bit of housekeeping. This is a webinar, so you are all on mute and your microphone and your cameras are off. If you'd like to pose a question, please do so in the Q&A rather than the chat. So I'm only moderating one channel. That would be very helpful. I do recognise that depending on your device that you may have to only use chat. That's fine, but my preference is Q&A just to make my job a little easier. We do have a feedback form as well at the end with a quick response, a QR code that I'll show you at the end of the session. And as always, we deeply appreciate your feedback. So if you complete that quick survey, we would be very grateful. So let's open up to our panellists, and we have some long-time friends of Praxis with us today, and some of Australia's really leaders in some of the topic areas that we hope to cover today, particularly around GCP and also around remote access, which is certainly Alan's expertise. So let me just quickly introduce the panel. We have Dr. Sophie Mepham, who is the Executive Manager of Research for the ICON Group, and as I mentioned, Sophie is also the founder of Sophie Mepham GCP, and still maintain one of Australia's best GCP trainers, and we're thrilled to have you with us today, Sophie. Recently moved to Tasmania and enjoying life in beautiful Hobart. We also have Kelsey Dobell-Brown, who's the manager for Clinical Trial Support Unit of Southwestern Sydney. I've missed an S out, but it's Southwestern Sydney Local Health District and the Ingham Institute. And Sophie's, sorry, oh, my brain is not working today.
That's okay.
Oh,
it's all good.
And Kelsey is also an accredited GCP trainer. And then finally, but not insignificantly, we have Alan Bakuya, who's the clinical operations lead for Trial Docs, which was an organisation he established in 2013 and later went on to establish the cornerstone product Site Docs portal, which has enabled remote monitoring throughout the past 8 years. And I'm sure that many of you in the audience are using Site Docs and Trial Docs. And for those who aren't, Alan can probably give some insights into that during today's session. For those who don't know me, I'm Melanie Gentgall. I'm the CEO of Praxis, and I'll be the facilitator for today's session. But let's kick off by firstly asking you what questions you'd like us to address. So we have a bevy of questions we can go to, but we wanted to first ask you if there was a burning question that you'd like us to discuss. If you can't think of one now, that's fine. We'll just keep going through with our questions. But as the questions come to mind, please do pose them in the Q&A, because we will stop our panel questions to get to your questions, because for us today is about helping you to solve your problems. So I can't see anything that has come up as yet. So we might continue on then in the interest of time. And oh, we just have one that's come up. Okay, so Krish has asked a question. In your opinion, what's the most significant change to GCP coming up? We knew this was going to come up, and this is a question that we have for the panel. But let's open up the floor by addressing that question. So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to give my thoughts first.
Right. Thanks,
so, Krish, I'm assuming we're talking about the upcoming changes to R3 that we're anticipating coming in later this year. I think there's a number of really exciting initiatives, and one area that I think is going to be of real interest to those of us working in clinical trials is how we utilise data that we don't traditionally collect at the moment. We're already seeing a lot of big pharma starting to talk a lot about the use of real-world evidence and real-world data. The FDA has taken a very interesting stance on starting to potentially use that data in drug approval processes, and looking at some of the high-level feedback coming out from ICH at the moment. There is definitely a focus on how do we use data that we haven't traditionally collected as part of clinical trials in the past. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area for us. It's certainly an area that I'm really interested in for where I work now, and I know a lot of other organizations are as well, is we all have access to huge amounts of data. And if you consider what we share with sponsors via our clinical trial participants, it's probably a very, very small amount compared to the data we will have available on all of the other patients that aren't in clinical trials. So I'm really interested to see where that goes, and what the guidelines are around how we utilize that. And I'm also really interested in the new emerging technologies. I think this was happening before COVID, but COVID has really, really pushed our need to embrace newer and more innovative technologies. So I think things like teletrials, wearables, e-consent systems, even the shift we've seen during COVID around how we sign off documents. We've gone from a fully paper-based process to a fully electronic just because of COVID. And I think maybe handing over to Alan, I think EISFs and ETMFs and the ability to allow sponsors to still see what we do without actually having to be at site is going to be incredibly important. There are lots of other things that I think will come. For me, they're the two areas that I think are going to be quite groundbreaking in terms of how it changes clinical trials.
Thanks, Sophie. Alan, did you want to comment on where you think we're going to see the biggest changes in GCP?
Yeah, I think there'll be, certainly from the guidance so far that we've seen, there will be a lot more information around expectations on the systems that are being used and validation of that. So what we're seeing is certainly from pharma that on average every trial will run in the order of 6 clinical platforms per trial. And now we're seeing on the other side of the fence with sites now taking on their own platforms. So there will be more expectation around, and because of the reliance on that data, on the validation of those systems that you're using. So having some good mechanisms in place for validating the various systems that you're using will be important and will be addressed in this as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that folds out.
Great. Kelsey?
Yeah, sure. So I always feel like GCP is trying to play catch up because I think they were using a lot of these systems already. I think that, and for the most part in our health district at a local site level, we have a really good relationship with our IT teams and our cybersecurity teams to ensure that we're using these platforms safely and in accordance to all of those regulatory requirements. So I mirror what both Alan and Sophie have said. Really exciting times ahead, but I think that we are just playing catch up with GCP.
Yeah, look, my final comment, and I concur with everything that's been said, and I think what's really exciting is the future-looking focus of E6R3 and the fact that it's going to bring into context some of those other guidelines that have sat sort of remote from E6, but are really critical to the way that we think about design and conduct of clinical trials. And I think the thing that we will see the most from a clinical practice perspective is that we will see that there is more of a focus around quality management. And I know this is something that anyone who's been to our training sessions will recognise. It once was a nice but not necessary, but it's now going to be a necessary. And we're going to need to provide more evidence of our commitment to quality as part of our practice. But I think it's a very, very exciting time, and it is about innovation and it is about future looking. And I think you're right, Kelsey, it's also about now it's time to catch up to where we've actually got to with clinical trials practice. We have another question in our Q&A. This one's from Baldir, who says, what are possible solutions for rapid clinical trial deployment and implementation in line with GCP guidelines and regulatory requirements, especially in COVID-19 research and in places where there's a COVID crisis? I think this is a really important question given what we're experiencing in Australia currently. So, Kelsey, did you want to think about that one?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that one. We have our sites have a really good relationship with both the ethics committee locally and the governance committee locally. So what we've done is actually communicated with them about the COVID studies coming up, and we've actually discussed with them priority requirements for those studies. So just for an example, yesterday I put a COVID study amendment through our RGO office, and I got a response in 2 hours. Wow. So it is possible to get that through quickly, but again, it's the communication aspect. So if you are communicating really clearly and transparently with your local ethics and governance officers, then they are more than happy from my perspective to actually accommodate that. And even if there is a sponsor out there who wants to conduct chapter study, having those conversations early. Most sponsors are really happy to work with you and support you through that process. And again, historically, and this is just not this time in Southwestern Sydney, but last time, what we found is that early engagement is key. Communication with sponsor and ethics committees is key, and we can get those submissions through very, very quickly. We had also contingency plans in place where ethics committee members were actually on call for us. So there are you know, plans that we can actually implement in this current situation that work really well. And I guess it's just sort of about you at your site communicating really well with those teams that you're associated with. And obviously it's the supporting departments as well. And to be honest, I find that everyone's willing to engage effectively and efficiently, because it is a crisis situation, is something that is unseen, and we all are actually working together really well, and that's my experience with it.
So I guess, Kelsey, what you're saying is that for many organisations, the first outbreak really gave us some precedent around putting systems and processes in place and having contingency plans. And now it's time to reactivate those, but it's also probably a time to say, well, if you didn't put those plans in place, here's a reason why you should be putting them in place, because there's nothing to say that this is not going to happen again and again and again over the next little while. And also, as you said, to reach out to your decision makers, to reach out to those, to the officers, your HREC, your Research Governance Office, and seek their advice and guidance. Alan and Sophie, have you got any advice on, and you know, a new study comes your way and it lands on your doorstep today and it's a COVID-related study, and how are you going to fast track it?
Saw a situation of that last year where we were needing to do a rapid deployment across 85 sites in Australia and New Zealand, and what we saw that was important in that process, and a quick implementation that's using technology, is to ensure that training is provided quickly, and the question was also around GCP and I guess the documentation of that training was as critical, but being able to provide training possibilities at a time that suits all time zones, and being able to run that, roll that out as quickly as possible and provide certification, so that there are at least, not only to have quick deployment of that type of technology, but then also to equip them as well. Compliance
related activities. Sophie, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, so where I work, we're focused fully on oncology studies. So we don't work directly on COVID, and our focus has been on how do we ensure that those studies are impacted as little as possible. Creation of an innovations team, which we've actually maintained, has been critical. And as Alan said, it's about technology, but it's about understanding some of the things we can all do to ensure that studies are open timely. And I think perhaps in Australia, we've not been quite as impacted, say, as places like the UK, where normal services around cancer treatment or other diagnoses have been delayed. There is still that absolute requirement to not take our fingers off the pulse for all of the other parts of medicine that we all care for. And we don't want to see cancer diagnosis is being delayed or other conditions. So for our organisation, again, as Alan said, it was technology. For me, I think DocuSign had the biggest impact. Rather than have to wait for physical documents to come to me, to the PI, and to go back to the sponsor, implementing DocuSign had a huge impact. I'm actually able to sit with my phone on a plane and actually review contracts and sign them off there and then. And I can't underestimate the impact of that in terms of something that could have taken 2 weeks by the time it had got to all the different parties to be signed is now done in I set my own guidelines of I won't leave a contract less than 4 hours in my inbox. I think those kind of things are critical because contracts are often a place where study startup can be really significantly delayed. and that sits with me. So my responsibility in all of this is to do the bits that I can, but also understand remote monitoring has been a huge thing for us during COVID and has allowed our studies to stay open. So enabling monitors to still get access to source without having to come to site has been critical. So for me, it's all been about technology and embracing the incredible amount of opportunities that we have now around being able to either rapidly deploy COVID studies, or for those of us not working in COVID, how do we ensure that our patients aren't impacted, and as much as possible we keep offering the same level of service.
Yeah, great. So I guess just to summarize, it's about making sure that you've got the right technology to help you to get these trials up and running at the right, at haste, which is what we need, to make sure that you've got the right people and that they've got the right skill mix and that you've got evidence of that, and to make sure that your conversations with your RGOs and your ethics office are open and transparent. And as you said, Sophie, that things that are traditional roadblocks are fast-tracked, like getting contracts into play. All right, we've got another couple of questions. And Zian has asked a couple of questions about consent and also about remote monitoring. I think we're going to get into remote monitoring with a couple of our questions, so we might leave that. But I might just ask the question to the panel that Zian has asked about remote consent and what is the best way of managing this. So Alan, can I throw that one to you to begin?
The angle that I'd take on that question is, I guess, the timing of the access. So that the consent, however this is being captured and made available to the monitor, from the monitor's perspective, they should be able to review that consent before all the content, the rest of the medical records is made available to them for review. So that's the point that I would make, is the timing of access for the rest of the data needs to follow after the consent is actually reviewed. And so the ability to do that with the technology used is going to be important.
So Sophie, what happens if the dates are different because there's a delay? So what happens if the participant signs on one date and because this is remote access, the investigator doesn't sign till a subsequent date? How do we manage that from a good clinical practice perspective?
So if this was something that was happening with one of my studies, my first discussion absolutely would be with my ethics committee around what my process was going to be. And we saw a huge amount of change again during COVID, exactly related to this, because that ability to have face-to-face interactions was so rapidly diminished. And as we've already said, ethics committees have been incredibly responsive in this space. And I think any ethics committee would be very understanding of the fact that things had to change. And I also think that anybody monitoring a study would understand if these things had to change. It's about discussion with your ethics committee. It's about putting in an amendment to your trial to say, either for this trial, we will be managing it via remote consent, or there's been a change to this study due to COVID. And as I said, all of the ethics committees have been focused on how do we keep our current studies open. I've not heard any feedback that ethics committees are putting up any kind of roadblocks or would give us any issues, but it's about, why do you need to change? How are you going to manage that change? And how do we document what we've done? Keeping that in your site file and just being very clear around keeping those documentation trails.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I think explaining why that had changed and putting in anything that you can to help support that the patient has done things exactly the way we would like them to do. As somebody who also gets involved in auditing at sites, as I've seen these changes come in, as long as those documentation has been there, ethics has been notified, governance has been notified, and the reason why is clearly documented, I as an auditor would not have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It's about documentation, and it's about making sure that you keep evidence of the necessary changes, because we know that ethics committees, as Sophie, as you've said, around the country, gave lots of opportunities for studies to be adapted to a changing environment. And we know that there was guidance from regulators like the FDA, who provided, you know, a full suite of guidance around how to manage remote consent. Kelsey, did you have anything else? Because Tracy's got a very good question.
Yeah, just quickly, Mel, I think that what's really important here is to understand that the principles of GCP around consent don't change just because it's e-consent. Documentation is still there, exactly what Sophie had said. So just thinking about, yes, you are doing it differently, but you are still talking to the patient, you are still documenting everything. So those principles do not change. It's just the method in which that is being conducted that changes.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really key point, Kelsey, because if you're always thinking about the participant and their safety and welfare first, then it's just a matter of changing the way that you do things, but that's going to be your primary focus, and making sure that when you change things, that it doesn't change your ability to keep them safe and well. So Tracy's asked a question here. On a multi-site study, should sites speak to the lead HREC or their local HREC re-remote consent? It's an interesting one. My suggestion is both.
I would say both, just to be sure. Yeah. I would start with my local HREC and then ask their advice about whether or not they wanted to notify the lead HREC. But I think in times like this, documentation is critical. I think better to do it via two emails or 2 letters at once, and ensure that everything's been appropriately covered. That would be my thought.
Yeah, I second that, Sophie.
Yep. Okay, I think we're all agreed on that. So Sonia has a question here. Sonia is a research ethics and governance officer, and she confirms what we've said here. So it wasn't really a question, it was a comment. That communication is critical, and just be clear, transparent, and document. And we know that that is a key element of GCP. Okay, let's keep going then. So we might go to our first panel question, our first structured panel question. So Sophie, what are the GCP requirements of managing a trial outside of Australia, and how do we maintain oversight and quality?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. I think this has been a really interesting one during COVID, particularly because there's been the need for rapid deployment of studies that people want to see open in more than one country for obvious reasons. The role of the sponsor is obviously has an overarching responsibility for all aspects of study conduct. And I think this is a really important question, where it is a combination of good clinical practice requirements, but also country-specific competent authority requirements. So if I take the UK as an example, if we were here in Australia, we wanted to have a study open at sites in the UK, actually one of the first things we need to do is understand the local competent authority requirements. And the UK, in a very similar way to Australia, is very specific that there has to be a UK-based sponsor. And this is where things can get quite complicated in terms of running studies. By no means should it stop us doing it, but most countries will ask for a country-specific sponsor. That is a legal entity within that country that is capable of taking on the requirements of being a sponsor. So there's a study that I'm working on in my organisation at the moment, where there is interest from doctors in the UK. So we're talking about an oncology study here. And right at this moment, we are working with one of the NHS hospitals to understand their ability to take on sponsorship for that study in the UK. So we cannot act as sponsor because we don't have a legal entity within the UK. In terms of once that's happened and you have clearly identified an organisation, again, it comes back to contracts and documentation. So roles and responsibilities, and having those contracts in place around who is responsible for what becomes incredibly important. And I think the Global Trial Management Committee probably becomes the most important part of running that study. So how do you ensure that all of the key players from all of the countries have that clearly defined group where they come together to discuss all aspects of study conduct. One area that is very straightforward to ensure is streamlined between multiple countries is quality. So having standard quality management systems in place as much as possible, using the same SOPs, the same policies, the same procedures, is actually a very straightforward way of ensuring that a study is run well. But I think it's the contracts, it's the communication, it's that overarching global trial management committee, but also the capability to have a global ECRF that actually enables real-time access and review of data going in all over the different countries. But I think for me, the key areas that you need to be aware of would be monitoring, and how is that going to be managed in a different country? How do we ensure the integrity? How do we ensure PI oversight is happening when a study that we have responsibility for is not happening in a country where we can't easily audit or monitor what's happening? And for us, the other key area is safety reporting. How do we make sure the process for reporting safety events in a different country, how do we ensure that the sponsor in that country is then communicating critical safety information to us? And then how do we relay that information back out in terms of any changes we might make? So it's about understanding in depth the competent authority requirements in each country where you want to open your study.
And I think, Sophie, it's about doing a really robust risk assessment and doing that proactively and saying, right, looking at the critical to quality factors, thinking about quality by design, and thinking what are the things that could occur that are either likely or that will have high impact, and putting in place strategies to manage those should they occur. So taking a proactive rather than a reactive approach. And once you build that skill set, then you can apply that to subsequent studies where you've got international sites as well. So we might, Jonathan's got a comment rather than a question. So we might just keep moving, because I wanted to ask this question to Alan. What local and international regulatory requirements do we need to ensure we comply to if we want to create an electronic investigator site file? Sorry, Alan, can't hear you. You're on mute.
Here we go. There's a number of guidances we can refer to for the US and also across Europe, but I want to take this back to grassroots and managing the content electronically as opposed to the old paper model that we've been used to. I'll refer back to a very good industry vetted document, and that is the framework for the destruction of paper. So if we're now going to be, and there's now a version 2 of that over the past couple of years, and that particular guidance goes through a lot of aspects, whether it be legal, regulatory, records management, a lot of aspects of, and also GCP, a lot of the various fundamentals of converting documents to electronic, and the systems, the validation of the systems that we actually use to contain those. So I feel like that's probably globally speaking, and it also addresses a number of the regulatory requirements across the globe. So I feel like that's probably a really good starting point, certainly for sites who are wanting to progress from their paper to digital. And also locally should be looking at that through the eyes of the Australian privacy principles. So that covers 13 key principles that we should be following and must be following regarding privacy. Kelsey touched on this as well. We need to be working very closely with, certainly at the site level, with IT requirements when it comes to privacy, which would back that Australian privacy principle piece up, but also security and the security of the content based on where it's being housed as well. So framework for destruction of paper, Melanie, and I would also refer back to the Australian privacy principles, not just for EISS, but for the plethora of electronic platforms that are being used at sites now.
What does CFR 21 say, Alan? What do we have to do to comply with that?
So it covers a number of things. So first of all, all the basics such as audit trails, backups, electronic signatures. Electronic signatures are being used a lot across sites now, and if electronic signature policies aren't in place, then I would recommend starting to put that together as well. But also addresses validation requirements for technology. And I know that I'm seeing this a lot also with what we're using. A lot of the sites are going through their own validation process as well prior to actually using technology, which is really good. And so, CFR Part 11 is a really good fundamental foundational starting point as well.
Okay, great. Okay. So there's a number of requirements that we need to be thinking about, and it's probably the kind of thing you need to get some expert guidance on. Kelsey, what are you using locally? I know that you've transitioned primarily across to electronic ICFs. Is that right?
Yeah, so we implemented an electronic ICF back about 12 months ago. And that's actually worked really well with the sites that have taken that up. We piloted initially with all of our COVID studies where we could actually monitor remotely. We could upload source documents into that system. And we were able to monitor those trials throughout the life cycle of those trials. And in fact, we closed one out recently without even having to do any face-to-face interaction with a monitor. And it worked really well. It was very efficient. Again, what Alan said before, we also, if we're using any electronic system like an EICF or e-consent, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we're communicating with our IT and our cybersecurity teams to make sure that we're compliant with any of those privacy laws. So that would be your first step. But it's definitely something that is doable. And it's just about us just jumping into that boat and actually sailing away and getting it done.
Have you found that it's actually increased? Have you found that it's increased your efficiencies, improved your efficiencies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, electronic signatures, making from, just for simple things like getting an email from a sponsor or a CRA with all your documents in it, all you have to do is upload it directly to your EICF rather than having to print it out, file it, all of those things. Space saving, there's so many aspects. We don't have to worry about archiving in boxes anymore. We just click a button. So it's not just efficiency, it's also money that has been saved by doing it this way.
Yeah, of course. Alan, there's a couple of comments here from people who, could you just in the chat function perhaps just put some links to those guidances that you mentioned?
Yes.
Otherwise, you can send them to me.
I think easier. I will send those through to you afterwards.
Yeah, and then I can distribute to everyone from the call. Okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to some audience questions now. And Trish has asked about investigator-initiated studies, the age-old question of the PI as sponsor. And she's got two questions, so we might roll them into one. So I think it's fairly clear that the PI as sponsor under GCP, then they have to comply with the requirements and absorb all of the sponsor requirements that are specified under GCP. That's very, very clear. But how do you get the investigator to comply with those sponsor responsibilities? That's the challenge. Any comments?
I can.
Golden wand.
So we've got a very comprehensive investigator-initiated trials portfolio where I am, and I have somebody dedicated to our investigator-initiated trials. full time because of the complexities. We have a very, very clear policy that we do not allow PIs to act as sponsor. That's our own institutional decision. There's a lot of risks that we're just not comfortable to take on board. Things like insurance and indemnity is a huge piece for us. So instead of that, we actually provide the PIs with a team of people that can actually support their investigator-initiated trials, number one.
So sorry, Sophie, does that mean that ICON will always take the responsibility as sponsor? So ICON
Correct.
will always be sponsor. It won't
Correct.
be an individual. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
I guess that's great in a big
Yep.
organisation like ICON.
Yes.
We've got a lot of investigator-initiated trials in Australia happening in our universities and in our hospitals. What are some mechanisms that we can get to get PIs to understand what their responsibilities are?
Even in where we work, even just a PI acknowledgement document is really helpful. So we're just in the process of creating this document where we actually lay out the responsibilities of a PI, either for externally sponsored studies, which are obviously much more straightforward, but also around, when you're actually acting as the sponsor. So I think giving them the information up front about what they would actually be responsible for is a very important first step. I think around even that very first question around, does their own personal medical insurance cover them if something does go wrong? And I think ensuring as much as possible that they're supported by quality processes, even if they're very basic. This is what you must do in terms of your protocol design. These are the processes you must follow to get your study ethically approved and through governance. It comes back down to quality, I think, and ensuring that the PIs understand the importance of doing things appropriately. It's about communication, and I think it's about documentation again. Trish, it's a really, really hard one. And even where we've got people resourced to doing that, we still uncover things that have happened in the past or even now where you just sort of have no idea how that could possibly have happened, because the PIs, it can sometimes be a little bit like herding cats.
Yeah.
It is challenging, and I think it's about, as much as possible, building those relationships, having your documented processes, and keeping those communication channels open with them as much as possible. But I will agree, it is really challenging.
Yeah, and I think, Sophie, you've really hit the nail on the head there in regards to open lines of communication and accountability, and also recognising that the institution has a role to play here as well, to monitor what the researcher is doing and to maintain that level of accountability there as well. So that's that monitoring oversight responsibility of an institution, but making sure that your processes and policies and procedures are all very transparent so that your investigators know what the requirements are of them when they are acting as sponsor. And I love that concept that I know you use often, Sophie, which is the investigator agreement, so that it's very clear that they are signing off on what they agree to do. Eleanor, Kelsey, did you have anything to add there before we go on? Because there's a couple of other really nice questions in the Q&A.
No, that's okay. Just move forward unless Alan has a comment.
Nothing to add to Sophie's response.
So there's a question here from Karen. So what platforms are commonly used for EICF? Kelsey, would you like to talk about what you're using or what you've had experience with?
Yeah, sure. So we are using Viva SiteVault. It's a platform that has brought to us by Transcelerate, I believe, and we had that reviewed by our cybersecurity team, and it's all compliant with CFR Part 11 and all other regulatory requirements. So we implemented that about 12 months ago, and it's a really easy system to use. And I guess from a local health district point of view, it's something that is free. and it's been provided free to us. And all of the educational platforms that are associated with that EICF are embedded into the platform itself. So there's a 24-hour help desk available to us. There are training sessions available to us. So we found it really, really easy to use and helpful. And certainly we've been using it for 12 months now, and I can't really fault it.
So Kelsey, I just want to clarify, you're using that for electronic consent as well as electronic site files?
So at the moment, it's an electronic site file. However, they are implementing an e-consent, which we are going to pilot in the next few months.
Great, because sorry, and I know that the acronyms are very common and we shouldn't use the acronym. I should have, it's very similar, sorry, I should have spelled it out. Karen's question was around electronic
e-consent.
Consent platforms.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, the one that I'm most familiar with is Consentic.
Right.
Which is an e-consent platform, an off-the-shelf platform, and it's an Australian one. There are lots of US-based platforms as well. But Sophie and Alan, do you want to comment on that?
We're just exploring our options for e-consent at the moment. So we're implementing, and we've got site docs, trial docs with Alan, which is hugely important to us. We also use Divana and Realtime as our CTMS systems. And we're just exploring the ability for us to start using e-consent. So that's an area that we're currently exploring at the moment.
Yeah, and we're also exploring Clinical Conductor. We're implementing that as our CTMS, and they've got a e-consent platform as well.
Yeah, and I noticed someone just posted something about RedCap with e-consent too. And Melanie, I will just provide a couple of there are a few that's come across my desk in the last 6 months or so. So I'll provide those to you as well.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Okay, so another question here from Helen. So are research nurses and coordinators able to consent patients to drug or device trials if they are study investigators, so if they are principal investigators for that study, or are listed on the delegation of responsibilities log to perform consent? Understanding this is just not consenting to the research, and any medically driven interventions would still be completed by an appropriate physician. I'm getting mixed responses and look forward to hearing what the group thinks.
I can give my immediate thought on that. For drug trials, if that's what you're talking about, Helen, my immediate answer to that would be no, that research nurses and study coordinators shouldn't. GCP general guidelines, if it's for drug or device trials, it should be a medically trained investigator. In my 25 years, I've never seen a research coordinator or a research nurse able to take consent for a patient for a drug or a device trial. Not for other non-interventional studies. Yes, it absolutely happens, and perhaps that's where you may be getting the mixed messages. However, if the sponsor and the ethics committee, because remember, part of the ethics application is to very clearly document the consent process, not just how you'll consent, but who is going to manage the consent process. If your protocol stipulates that that's going to happen, you've described that in detail in your ethics application, the ethics committee have reviewed that and approved it, then you could. And so my guidance to you initially would be no. Generally speaking, study coordinators and research nurses don't take consent for drug or device trials. But if you had any questions, it would be your ethics committee that would be the ones who would have overarching say on the consent process, because the consent process is part of the ethical review and approval.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with what Sophie said, but I have seen that exception where it has been a PhD trained nurse who was able to take consent or undertake the consent process, but that was ethically approved and was written into the protocol. So there's hurdles you'll need to jump. It's not impossible, but there will need to be very valid reasons for why that would be the case in an interventional study, as Sophie mentions. But that's a really good question. Thanks for asking that, Helen. Maria has also got another question, and as we're seeing more and more use of things like EPROMs, then this really is a really important discussion around how much information do we have to give to an ethics committee. We know that they need to review all patient-facing screens, or whether they be web or app-based, which could, on an EPROMS application, be hundreds of screens. Has anybody come across this, and what might be your suggestions for managing it?
I think my first feedback that a GP states that written information needs to be provided to the subjects. That's normally referring to written information about the trial itself. So that would normally be the patient information and consent form, any adverts that we might use, any specific information that is about the study is provided to ethics committees. What we would expect to see is that the information about the EPROMs that you're using is within the PICF. That is what we would generally use. I agree with you. There is a big shift, and we're certainly looking at a brand new EPROM system at the moment, which is a great real-time reporter for AEs for patients. And where we may end up utilizing that, we would need to make sure that the information about that was very clearly documented in the PICF, so that we're submitting it all in one go to the ethics committee rather than doing it in separate pieces. But I think this comes back to the very first question about the changes to R3, which very clearly states that they completely understand that there has been such a huge shift in technology over the last couple of years that I think this is something they're going to have to consider and hopefully come back to us with more guidance, because you are right, there are lots and lots of different systems that have now shifted to being online. But if you think about, let's go back to the old-fashioned way, 20 years ago before all the technologies came out, it was still very common for us to give patients quality of life paper. And the PICF would just say that we will ask you to complete a written quality of life form at time points throughout the study. We didn't have to give the patient copies of that, of those quality of lives up front. They were there if they wanted to see them. But I think in the same way, if the patients want more information about what we're going to ask them to do, we should always be prepared to give it to them, but we should be giving them a very high level description of what's going to be involved within the PICF. That would be my take. But I do hope that this falls very much under ICH's requirements to review these new technologies and give us some more guidance about how we should be communicating that, because this didn't exist 10 years ago.
And I think the question really from Maria is around how do we provide that to our ethics committees as far as validation of the tools. And I guess, Maria, one of the things that I would ask you to consider is if that is a validated EPROMs or an EPREMs, then there should be something that sits alongside that technology that the provider has produced that you can then use for submission to your HREC. So I'd go back to the EPROMs provider, and because this would not be a common issue for an uncommon problem for them, ask them to give you some guidance and have your discussion with your ethics committee and say, what do you need? What is the minimum requirement you need to satisfy the use of this technology is ethically acceptable? So have that conversation with both your provider and your HREC. Okay, so this is a great question, and it comes back to equity of access to research for diverse populations. So Duncan has asked, where do the panel sit with providing consent information to patients from cold backgrounds? Do they need to read the entire consent form? Is the use of interpreters or family members, depending on patient preference, suitable? And I think this is a discussion that we've really put to the side for a very long time, and something we need to be addressing more actively and more openly. So I invite the panel to share their experience.
So Melanie, I can start with that. We have quite an extensive multicultural Black background in Southwest Sydney, and so we have two rules of thought for consenting patients who don't speak English, and of course we adhere to GCP requirements. One is that we have an English consent form, and we invite an interpreter into the clinic space to have a discussion with the investigator about that that study. And we also obviously get them to ask questions, answer questions, and have that time to ensure that they make an informed choice. And we also have an impartial witness within that process as well. So one is having an English consent form and explaining it. And the second one is, if possible, having a consent form in their own language. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. A lot of sponsors are reluctant to do that for us, but then there are sponsors who are actually able to support us with that. So it depends on the sponsor and whether they can provide a translated consent form for you. I would recommend that can happen in most circumstances. But again, having that really transparent conversation up front during that feasibility stage is really important. Like I said, in most instances in our local health district, more than 60% of our patients do not speak English, and there is a significant proportion that are illiterate. So having that process embedded in our ethics application is really important. Having that process embedded into our day-to-day activity on how we present consent to patients of a non-English speaking background is really important for us. And then just sort of having that really clear understanding of what the requirements are in terms of GCP.
Excellent, thanks, Kelsey. Alan or Sophie, did you want to comment?
Something I will say just very quickly, Sophie, is that a lot of organisations certainly that are used to doing the translations outside of Australia, or CROs and sponsors will be used to a translation and a back translation, so they'll have their own processes for making sure the whatever consent ends up being provided in that foreign language is accurate. Just a additional note that I wanted to make there, Sophie.
Yeah, I think it's a really complex one. Melanie, going back to what you say, and interesting, when I do my GCP training, this is always a slide where we generate lots of discussion when English is not the patient's first language. And it's that delicate balance between, is it truly informed consent if we're not providing the information in the patient's own language, compared to on the other side of the scale, it's not ethical to not offer a study to somebody because English isn't their first language. And it's such a delicate balance for me. And Duncan, it's a really great question. Preference for me is to not let family members translate or interpret. I think that is there's a host of potential issues there, and in fact, and I'm going to try and dig it up and send it to you. And I actually think there was some really good research done by Peter Mack in the psycho-oncology department about patients who had a family member do the interpreting for them, and also the Chinese Cancer Society of Victoria have got some stats on this. It was quite an alarmingly high number of patients who weren't actually given the information that the doctor gave them, because the family member chose to leave out bits they didn't want a parent to hear. So I think there are some really very, very delicate issues, but I always sit, how do I ensure that I've balanced informed consent when it's not in their language against ensuring they're not being excluded because of English not being their first language. So
sorry, Soph, I'm just thinking we're nearly out of time as well, but I just wanted to make one comment on this, because this is critically important for all of us as part of the clinical trial sector, because for too long populations have been excluded. There is now a lot of guidance and support. ACTA have done some work around this, around promoting the inclusion of cold populations. There are groups out of the Southwestern Sydney Local Health District that have done some fabulous work around this as well. There's global recommendations on how we can improve inclusion of people from diverse backgrounds. And I think we just have to find the solutions. We just can't say it's just too hard. I think we just have to go out there and actively embrace the challenges and find the solutions. And technology is going to be a pathway to enable that. But you know, I think we have an imperative to meet that demand.
Yeah, and making friends with your interpreter service is really important.
Yeah, good point, Kelsey. All right, we are at the end of our, in fact, we've gone to the 60-minute mark, as I anticipated we might. I think we've answered all of the questions that were in the chat. We didn't really get to Ziane's question about guidance around remote monitoring. So I might just ask you that quickly, Alan, as our final question. How do we manage remote monitoring? And Ziane's particular question is it okay to share screen to show monitors source data, medical records so they can do SDV? Does that break confidentiality? How can we put in place best practice to share information? So over to you, Alan, our last question, and then we'll close out.
Just quickly, so certainly it needs to be, we need to ensure we have the consent from patient and ensure that the consent is inclusive enough to capture this type of sharing. And secondly, irrespective of the platform that you've vetted locally, it's important that process and agreement is in place with the person you're sharing information to. So having agreement, written agreement around certain rules of engagement, if you like, by the monitor at the other end of this viewing process to ensure that they've actually documented their agreement to certain practices when it comes to what they do with that at the other end. For example, no downloading of content. The technology shouldn't allow that for that to start with, but no screenshots, no downloading. So not just does the technology account for it, but there's the process and is there agreement in place from the right people.
Wow, so time consuming, so time consuming. Kelsey, your experience.
Look, I think, again, we have to understand what platforms you're currently using in your health service. And now I'm just coming from the health service point of view, but we need to make sure that it's compliant with our privacy laws, which are quite stringent. Actually having conversations with IT and with cybersecurity again. I know that certain things like Zoom and Skype are not permitted to have those conversations about specifically source documents. So we have to make sure that we're using the platforms that are approved by our local sites and our local health service. And also things like an eICF does help because it actually already meets all of those requirements. So it is complex, Mel. It is time consuming, but once you get it embedded, it actually becomes far more easier and far more efficient.
Build once, use often.
That's right, yes.
Sophie, your final comments around access to documents for source data verification for monitors remotely?
It's been a game changer for us. So, you know, it's meant that our studies have been able to keep going. So very much like Kelsey said, we work very closely with our IT teams to ensure that everything meets the required privacy. There are certain processes we have to put in place, but it's been a game changer for us, and it's meant that we've been able to continue the majority of our studies during COVID, and obviously with things changing now, it will continue to be the mainstay of what we do, and actually moving forward, we would prefer to see more remote monitoring than the traditional face-to-face, wherever that works for the sponsor.
So can I ask what platform you use then, Soph? What have you found? Are you using
a lot of ours with trial docs, with
Yep.
and site docs has been the big thing for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
For sharing. Excellent. Because I think it's the resources that people are also looking for in sessions like this. You know, where do we go to get some of that information? So, Kelsey, you've got Viva, you're using trial docs and site docs, and of course, Alan, that's your passion and your business, and that's great. We'll share some of that information with everybody and some links after the session. There's been some questions about the recording. We will put this recording up on our website and share that information. Could I ask you all now, on screen is the QR code to the link to the post-session survey. Could I ask you just to quickly complete that survey for us? We would be very, very grateful for your time. It's only a quick 2-minute survey. And as I said, we will share information about the session on our website once the recording has been made available. So thank you all. Thank you very much to our panellists for joining us today. Kelsey, given how busy you are and everything that's evolving around the region, we really value your time. Alan, great to have your insight and knowledge, particularly around remote monitoring. And so always fabulous to have you. And thank you for joining us, because you're on holidays too. We forgot to mention.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you all. Have a great day. And
Thanks, guys.
we look forward to seeing you join us at our next session. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.